things about documentation. It's always exciting. All right. So I was told to talk for like 20 minutes or so. And this is like the talk that I've given a couple times, and it usually takes about half an hour or 35. So I'm going to probably not go through the whole thing. I'm going to start with kind of part one. And then if people have questions or anything that you specifically want to know, we can kind of move around, or I can kind of keep talking about what I want to talk about. But I always enjoy, kind of tailoring things to, what folks want to hear and, what is actually interesting to you, not what is interesting to me. So anyway, who am I? Hans gave me this fancy clicker thing, so I can look like a real professional speaker. So I'm the maintainer of Read the Docs, which is a documentation hosting site for Python, and lots of other languages, but Python is kind of where it started and where it came from. I can talk about that more later if people want. I'm also the co-organizer of Write the Docs, which is a conference about writing documentation, which is why I'm here. That's in Budapest in like a week and a half, so a week from this upcoming Monday in Budapest. It's 2 days. I think it's like, tickets are like €50, but if you want to come and you're interested, I can give you discounts and do magical things. So feel free to come up and talk to me if you want to come and come down from Prague or Brno or whatever. Mikey's also speaking at that conference, so if you want to see more of us talk about documentation and even more people, in case you're not sick of documentation already. And I've just been traveling around Asia and Europe and all these things, and figured I would come say hi and talk about docs. So what you should do, stop me if anything's unclear. Stop me if I'm talking too fast. I'm a native English speaker, so I can do all sorts of magical things, like use words you don't understand. And, so, feel free to stop me and ask questions at any time. Raise your hand or chuck something at me or whatever. And hopefully you'll learn something. That's kind of the goal, me standing here and speaking to you. So this is what the talk is generally about. I give every talk, I kind of start with why you should write documentation, because I think for a lot of programmers, that's really before I start talking about writing documentation, I need to convince people why writing documentation is a good idea. So hopefully, by the end of the first 5 minutes, you'll be like, oh, that documentation thing, it's kind of a good idea. And then I can talk about kind of the tech behind writing documentation. Restructured text is a markup language, much like Markdown. Sphinx is a documentation generator that renders that markup into fancy HTML PDFs, EPUBs, and whatnot. Then Read the Docs is what I built, which is a hosting thing. So it runs Sphinx magically against your code, and does stuff. So why write documentation, right? That's the thing. When you're talking to programmers, it's kind of like the third rail of programming. 5 years ago, it was like trying to convince people to write tests was hard. People now kind of like that has been adopted in the programming world, that like testing is a good thing. So now we're moving on to documentation, right? It's like the other thing that now we have to convince people that is a good idea. My favorite reason is very selfish, right? This is the best reason to write documentation. You ever opened your editor and been like, God, this code is awful. Whoever wrote this should be fired. Get blame. Oh God. I wrote that. Like, how does that even work? Like, when you go to use code that you just wrote 6 months from now, a year from now, it is the same as code other people wrote. You have to reload all that context into your brain. You have to do all this work to understand how the code actually works, right? And if you wrote down how the code works and why it works that way, when you wrote the code, you save yourself that entire loading up of state into your brain by writing down that state, when you wrote the code. That is the best reason to write docs. Write down what you were thinking when you wrote this code. Write down what it does. Write down why, specifically, this design decision was made. Because later you're going to come and look at it and be like, oh, we can optimize that away, and you're going to break everything. So you're going to be using your code later, and you're going to forget why you did things. Writing down why you did them is really important. As an open source developer, you want people to use your code, right? So you go to some GitHub repo and you're like, oh, or let's say you go to Google and you want to say, I want to parse JSON or whatever in Python. So I'm going to be like, Python JSON, and then you end up on some GitHub page, and it's like, this thing is called Python JSON package, and it has no README, right? You're not going to use that code. You don't know what it does. You don't know how it works. There's no way, if people don't write documentation, for you to understand what the code does without reading the code. And as I already kind of explained, right, reading code is not the best way to understand what it does. Like, people need to write down what the hell their code does for other people to use it. So if you, presumably you're writing code because it does something useful, and if you want other people to use that code, you have to tell them what it does, and you have to write documentation to do that. Similarly, you want to help people out, right? You're writing this code to solve a problem so that other people don't have to solve this problem again. And so if you document what you're doing, people can use the code, then they start to use it, and you can build a community, and you don't have everyone writing this code over and over and over again. And you get that like warm feeling when you get that first bug report from somebody using your code, and you're like, oh wow, people are actually using this. Oh god, and oh, this is kind of cool. If you write zero documentation, the chances of anyone else using your code is pretty small. This is another one of my favorite reasons. I don't know, has anyone here done kind of documentation-driven development or README-driven development, anything? One person? Everyone else should come to the conference because there's actually a talk on it. So the whole idea behind this is you write down what you want your API to look like before you build the API. So you open up your README and you're like, all right, this code is going to do this. This is what like the example code in the README is going to look like. And you do that before you start writing the code. So you can understand what your API looks like, how you want it to function from the perspective of a user. Before you get like really deep into it and you start worrying about what your data looks like and all these very implementation details. And then those implementation details have a way of making it into the API that's public, right? If you sit down and think about what you want it to look like and what it needs to do before you write the code, it gives you a much cleaner and better perspective on what your code should do before you write it. And this one, for a long time, I didn't value nearly as much as I should. Because somewhere along the way, I learned that being a software developer, you write a lot. I was like, oh yeah, I write code, right? I don't write words, I just write code. Like, oh wait, but I interact with email every day. I interact with bug trackers every day. I interact with IRC, I interact, 90% of what we do in open source and in companies is writing. And if you want to be a better writer, you have to write. And it's not writing like in, your class in high school or whatever, right? It's technical writing. It's how to explain ideas succinctly and in very good ways. Writing documentation is one of the best ways that I've found to become a better technical writer, which then is valuable everywhere. Like it makes you write better issues on GitHub or Jira or your open source and your corporate code is so much better explained. You're able to interact with mailing lists. All these things are all writing about technical issues. And doing that more and doing it with a sense of purpose is really, really important as a developer. I think communicating with text is one of the most important skills you can have as a software developer. So that's why you should write documentation, right? Like, hopefully that resonated with some of you. So this is normally where I kind of go on to talk about Sphinx and read the docs kind of with the technical stack. Does anyone have any questions about documentation in general, kind of before we move on?
I would have a question. You mentioned like documentation is important for you to read the code. Like, where do you draw the line between like comments in the code, the README, and the actual documentation? Like, where do you decide what's what?
Sure. So comments in the code are great for talking about the code, right? There's the classic thing of like comments is write the why, not the how, right? Comments in code should explain why things are done, not what they're doing. You'll get these really long kind of things with like Java doc style commenting where it's like, these are all the arguments, these are the return values, all that kind of stuff might be valuable, but I think like actual code comments above sections of code that are confusing is super, super important. If anyone says, I write code that self-documents, like run away. That is just like the scariest thing. It's like, oh, I don't have to write code comments. My code's so obvious, it just works. As far as READMEs, I think that's still kind of an open question. I think GitHub and Bitbucket and these kind of things have made READMEs much more important. Before GitHub, nobody wrote READMEs, or they didn't have quite the prominence that they do now. So I don't think we've quite figured out what should be in a README. I think what the project does, how to get help, support, kind of like it's the main introduction to the project, and that should kind of lead you onto kind of more parts of the documentation from there. So I think having a README is really important, just because GitHub made it really important. But yeah, I think that's still a relatively open question. So, anybody else? I didn't really give you much to ask questions about. So let me just talk about restructure text. Because this is another fun kind of philosophical part of the talk. So I think you should hopefully be able to view writing documentation and writing text a little bit differently after this. So a lightweight markup language, Markdown, textile, wiki markup, restructure text, all these things are basically a base format that you write in that is used to generate lots of other different formats. And kind of the main reason they exist is to be readable as plain text. And then they work well with programmer tools. Right? So if you have like a Markdown file, restructure text file, anything like that, it works really well with GitHub, it works really well with diffs, pull requests, all these kind of things, right? Like, you're working with plain text in a line-based format, it works well with all the tools that we've built for manipulating text, which is really important as programmers. And so the reason that lightweight markup languages are really interesting and important is because they give you semantic meaning over what you're writing. I don't know, do people kind of remember when like semantic HTML was a big deal like 5 years ago or so? Anybody? Yeah? The designers in the house, they're like, oh yeah, I remember that battle. What standard semantic HTML? So semantics is basically just separating, what something is versus what it looks like, for the most part. And then once you know what it is, you can separate the display. Anyone who's done CSS understands this pretty much implicitly. So you could just say, like issue 72, that's going to be bold. I'm just writing this in HTML, right? And then the proper way to do that is to have a class of issue. And then you say issue 72 is an issue, and then you come through with CSS and say, all issues are bold. And as programmers, it should be really obvious why this is better. Is because if we want to change how issues are displayed, we change this one place, and all issues get changed, right? If we're writing them just as bold, then there's no way to go back and say, change the way we display all the issues, right? That is what semantics gives you in a classic kind of HTML sense, right? Warning, don't do this in red. It's like, no, don't do that, right? Say, give it a class warning and make that class display red. And so this is where restructured text comes in, right? To generate, this HTML from restructured text and strings, you just write this, right? You say, warning, don't do this. And that is what you write in the file, and then when you generate HTML, it looks like this. So this content is abstracted away from both like what it looks like and the format that it's being output in, right? Whereas this is just HTML that's only outputted as HTML. This is in a base format that can be outputted as HTML, as PDF, as any other type of document that you want. So you're writing something that has a lot more semantic meaning. So semantic markup shows the intent of your words. Saying this is meant to be a warning. I'm not saying it's red, I'm not saying anything. I'm just like, as I'm writing this document, this is a warning. That's all you have to think. As the writer, you have this very kind of powerful vocabulary that you can use. And you don't have to think about this HTML is going to be a PDF, how is this rendering for our users? What's our design look like? What's the style? Like all of those concerns are out of your brain, right? You're just in pure writing mode. And then once you have this kind of pure semantic thing, you can generate whatever you want. You can make someone else deal with that, right? Make this look good in a PDF. I don't know how to do that. I just want to write documentation. So this is where I really kind of rail against Markdown. So Markdown is really, really simple. Markdown is beautiful, and Markdown serves a very specific purpose. Markdown is shorthand for HTML. Markdown is, you write it instead of writing HTML because it's easier than writing HTML. That is what Markdown is. It has no semantic markup really built into it in any way. It's just shorthand for writing HTML. Restructured text does a lot more than this. It gives you a much more structure and semantic meaning in the text files that you're writing. And restructured text is ugly. Like, I'm not going to argue that it's the most beautiful markup format ever invented, but a lot of this ugliness comes because it's solving a much harder problem than Markdown. So people like use Markdown and they're like, oh, restructured text is so like ugly and like, why is there all this crap in it? And like, why? It's like because it's solving a much harder problem and it's doing something that's much more important. So this is why I get really upset when people are like, why doesn't Sphinx just use Markdown? Like it's like, why isn't your HTML just a PDF? You know, I mean, they're different things. And it took me a long time to realize this, and I think that's a lot of the value that I can come and kind of explain to people. This is the takeaway, right? If you care about the documentation that you're writing, write it in a way that preserves semantic meaning. I missed the word there. Write in a way that preserves the semantics. When you're writing the documentation, you shouldn't be thinking about HTML. You shouldn't be thinking, this is going to be a link to a web page somewhere, right? You should be thinking about the document as a concept. So this is the part where I show people what restructured text looks like, but I don't think that's really, unless people want to see it, I don't think it's really relevant. All right, any questions on that part? I know you have questions.
What is Markdown?
All right. Alright, so this is a basic restructured text document. This is just a browser window that has the source on the left side and the rendered HTML on the right side. And so this is Markdown and restructured text are basically the same, where you're writing, what is restructured text, and you underline it, and that turns into a heading, right? That's saying this is a heading. And so when that renders into HTML, it turns into like an H1 or an H2 tag. Lists, things like that get rendered. So you just write in plain text with the dash, and it gets rendered into proper HTML. All those kind of good things. There's code blocks that get rendered properly. So this is basically what restructured text and Markdown both look the same, where you're just like, all right, let's write some text, and this gets rendered in HTML. Kind of the cool thing that restructured text gives you on top of that is it gives you a whole series of kind of functions, basically, that you can call. So here you can see it says, secnum. If we remove that, the section numbers over here just kind of disappear, right? So that's saying, put section numbers on this page with like that piece of markup. And this is saying, show a table of contents. Like contents, it's a tiny table of contents. Just saying, render a table of contents in this page. So if you remove that, table of contents goes away. So it's basically this really nice way of writing plain text that then gets rendered into multiple output formats through magic, basically. So that's kind of the idea behind the lightweight markup languages, is you just write plain text files with markup that then get rendered into other formats from there. Any other questions?
Is that even a dispute? Like, should I use Markdown instead of restructured text? Or is there anyone who would challenge that argument?
Yes. There are many people on the internet who would challenge anything you say. But there's a lot that actually challenge this very thing. So Markdown's great for blog posts. Markdown's great for comments on websites. I mean, it's an amazing markup language. It is basically the de facto way to write HTML on the web for programmers. It's the thing about when making the transition to writing documentation, I think people don't really appreciate the difference in scope that that requires in the tooling. So there's like, oh, let's just write HTML pages and that'll be our documentation, right? They don't quite, like, and Sphinx doesn't do a very good job explaining why it's better. But yeah, right, so it's just like people see documentation as just a set of HTML pages that they can write in Markdown, rather than understanding the interlinking and referencing and indexing and all of the things about writing real documents that are large and interconnected. That is hard and valuable, right?
So would you write your diploma thesis in restructured text?
Sure. I mean, I would write a book in restructured text.
Write it in Markdown.
I mean, you could. I mean, like Markdown works well, and it's one of those. It's a classic case of like good enough is the enemy of better, or whatever. Like where it's like Markdown works well enough to solve this problem that most people don't get. They look at restructured text, they're like, this is ugly, and then they never look at it again and understand why the ugliness is there and the different problem that it's solving. And that's because none of this is written down. Like the stuff I'm telling you, you can't go and read on the internet. So I'm gonna hopefully write it down at some point.
You should document your documentation.
Yeah, there's only so many hours in the day. But
Can you talk to restructured text?
can you pick up render restructured text? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's like Markdown. Like if you have a .rst on your file on GitHub, it'll render it. It won't support Sphinx specific Markdown. So if I had more time, I would give the rest of this talk that explains exactly. But restructured text is basically the base layer that gives you this extensibility of these functions. And then Sphinx comes along and gives you different functions that are more specific to writing technical documentation. And so that's the stuff that GitHub doesn't render, because they just render a single page. They don't render it as a project. And so all the cross-referencing and all that kind of stuff breaks, because they're not rendering it kind of as a whole.
Is it good for printed content?
So you can render a PDF that is...
Does it do correct paging?
Yeah.
Not leaving stuff at the end of pages?
Right. I mean, so it renders...
to LaTeX?
It renders into LaTeX, which then uses to render a PDF. So if you actually want to play with the LaTeX and get into that, I don't, but you might. Absolutely.
I just wanted to answer your question because I didn't want to troll, but I'm in the Markdown camp, so. Well, not really, because with restructured it's really better. But part what we are doing at our company is we use Markdown to create a way to describe your API in a structured way. And the reason we use Markdown instead of a structured text is mainly because it's far easier for non-technical, non-programmer people. And documenting when you are not documenting a Python library, the documentation is an intersect of work and more people than the programming themselves. And we find Markdown for better people there. So we are basically extending Markdown using keywords to give it semantic meaning. So
I generally...
Why we are talking about Markdown instead of restructured text is basically learning curve and aesthetic look of the source code.
Sure. I agree. Restructured text is definitely harder, and there are concepts that are inherently familiar to programmers, but are incredibly difficult for non-programmers, right? The whole concept of a function call and arguments to things. And
I would dare to say that even the concept of semantic meaning is hard for programmers.
Yeah. Sure.
Different what it means and what it is.
Right. Most people just care what it looks like. I just want to make this thing, and I want your tool to let me do that. No, I completely agree. So again, and this is why I give this talk to programmers, because you can see kind of the value in it. And if your target audience is non-technical people, restructured text is going to be much harder for them to grok. But for programmers, I think it's all the concepts map very similarly.
Yeah, well, actually, our target audience is mostly developers, but still.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people around them.
And if they're not willing to commit the time to actually learn how to use them.
I actually sometimes I'll find developers and the different pieces as well.
And a lot of people know Markdown, right? I mean, it's like the standard way of doing this on the web.
By the way, I think the most important of this idea is that it's necessary to have non-technical people on this type of project. I know that it's easy to describe some API for some package, but most projects have enough people on board, and it's necessary to give them tools to express. And it's sometimes very hard to make something like project manager to write restructured text. And similar, and it will be my next question is how to handle with images, because images sometimes explain a lot more than 100 words. And I have a big problem where to store it.
Right.
Because when you new version, you need to first put it into the repository and after that reference to them. How you achieve this goal?
Yeah, so I mean, the image, to actually describe an image is very simple. You can configure your image and give either a file system path or a URL, and it pulls the image in. The actually how to put the image into the source, I mean, that's, you know, if you're using the source control, then somebody has to commit it, right? I mean, like,
Okay.
or if you have a hosted solution that is like, you drag and drop it and it uploads it to S3, and yeah, there's you know, little things where you can, you know, have a widget where you drag it in, it uploads it and inserts the URL that S3 gave it or whatever. It's kind of how I've seen that done, is a user-friendly way of doing it. But yeah, I mean, this is generally meant to be written in a text editor, right? Like, and version, like, the way that I use it is version control, because everything on Read the Docs uses version control, because it's for programmers. But I'm sure you could do similar to how GitHub does it, right? Where I think you just drag an image and I think they do upload to S3 and insert into the page. I think that's the standard best practice.
It's a little messy. In one way.
Media is always hard. If you've ever had to set up Django and deal with static media, then you will appreciate how annoying it is.
I know restructured text is used a lot for Python documentation. Is it widely used for anything else?
Yeah. So I mean, like restructured text, no. Like Sphinx is the main reason restructured text exists in Python. It's not really used anywhere else. But there are a ton of projects that use Sphinx that are not Python, if that is your question. So like Docker is a Go project. It uses restructured text and Sphinx, you know, I mean, so Sphinx is made for writing prose documentation, not for documenting code APIs. So you can write prose about anything. You can write a book, you can write, you know, you're just writing words.
Yeah, I know I can. That's if anybody does it.
Yeah, no, so I had a blog post that, because I get this question a lot, where it's like, oh no, like, Sphinx is just for Python. Like, Sphinx isn't just for Python. So, you know, it's like, Julie is using it, they're writing their own language, Hi. There's JavaScript, PHP, Java, I mean, like Sphinx is used by lots of projects, because Sphinx is the most mature documentation generation system that exists in open source. Like, I am pretty much 100% sure of that, because I've been looking for like 2 years. Like every other community, pretty much the state of the art is a source code to API generation system. There's like PHP doc, Java doc, RDoc, you know, it's just like, give us your source code and we'll generate documentation from that. Like, very few other tools are actually about writing prose and sprinkling in some code, like, from source code if you want. But yeah, so Sphinx and Read the Docs are definitely heavily used outside, and starting to be more and more, right? It's slowly spreading across kind of ecosystem.
So, because in Sphinx you can pull in some documentation for Python classes.
Yes.
Are there plugins into other languages?
No. So they're I mean, who's supposed to?
I'm now in JavaScript and I want to use Sphinx. I really struggle in Sphinx.
So who's supposed to support that code? Like you're supposed to write an auto parser for every language that exists. Like
Yes.
Yes, please.
so Sphinx has like semantic. Like there's like a job. So Sphinx has the concept of domains, which is a way of specifying a programming language concept. So Python is the default one, but so there's the JavaScript. You can say this is a JavaScript function, this is a JavaScript, whatever. It has like the words that JavaScript uses, but it doesn't have the code that actually parses JavaScript, pulls it out, and does that part. Because that's like really? Like, do you expect I think there's extensions that do part of that, but I would love if someone wrote a JavaScript. So I assume there's some kind of standard API for pulling code comments out of JavaScript. So connecting that to Sphinx's, representation of those objects is possible, right? You can write an extension that would do that. And if you do, I will gladly retweet it and point people at it. Because people are like, I want you to read the docs on JavaScript. I'm like, you're missing the point.
Well, it's something that I'm listening to calling. I would do anything else, but I don't want to kind of understand also.
No, you get the point. I just mean people on the internet don't get the point. Right. And so I guess this is a good place to end this talk, is that I think that writing prose for your project is the only way to properly document it. And if you ship to your users something that is auto-generated from source code, you're basically saying, I don't care about my users. Like there is no way that documentation that is just generated in a hierarchy, probably with frames, that is generated from your source code is the best interaction for your users to actually understand how your software works. And so if that is like the tool that you're using, and that's the tool that your programming language community is the state of the art, like what? So I mean, I think that's the takeaway, right? Is that like Sphinx is a different approach to doing this, and no one else is doing it well, and so Sphinx is slowly expanding to fill that need in other communities. But I would love it if there were other tools like Sphinx from other languages, because they actually cared about writing documentation and they cared about their users. But I haven't seen it happen. So that's where I'll start, or end. So thank you.